Welcome back and thank you for staying with us. The 9th Proudly South African Expo will be taking place this coming week, starting tomorrow. It's the country's official Buy Local advocacy campaign. President Cyril Ramaphosa will deliver the keynote address on Tuesday. Now, to discuss the event and some of its eye-grabbing features is Aspen Pharmacare's Senior Executive, Dr. Stavros Nicolaou. A very good afternoon to you and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, good afternoon and thanks for having me on the program, and good afternoon to all the viewers.
Now, just give us first of all a sense of the importance of this Buy Local Summit as a critical driver of job creation as well as economic growth.
Yeah, a starting point for me here is that many successful economies around the world, if you go back in time, most recent times and post the World War, the Second World War, have built strong economic platforms underpinned by manufacturing and industrialization activities. So if we look at where the current economic trajectory is of our country, we all know we're experiencing at best pedestrian growth. And one of the sectors that have been identified to stimulate the economy on a path of both economic recovery but also a much longer-term sustainability is the manufacturing sector. Unfortunately, we haven't done well in manufacturing in recent times, despite the best efforts of, I cannot fault the Department of Trade and Industry, but when it comes to operationalizing these plans and implementing them, we have not done well in the country, neither in the private sector nor in the public sector. So tomorrow's localization summit presents an opportunity to press a reset button and galvanize both the private and the public sectors to get behind local manufacturing and local procurement. It's very necessary, particularly where our economy presently finds itself, but also as a boost to job creation after the shedding of jobs during the preceding 12 or 13 months of COVID.
And just speaking about coronavirus, this pandemic that has gripped the globe, I want you to speak to us about the impact it had on last year's summit. I believe it had to be cancelled. And what was the ripple effect that followed that? People that could have been perhaps able to sell or showcase their products and services. How did that affect them?
Look, COVID has affected just about every sector and parts of society, and the impact on last year's local summit, I happen to be a board member of Proudly South Africa. And of course, it had an impact there as well. One's required to readjust one's best laid plans, and it was no different with Proudly South Africa. But, with all of these challenges, new opportunities present. And I think one's always got to look at this from a perspective of what are you trying to achieve here? What we're trying to achieve is lessen the country's dependency on imports. We're far too import heavy in our economy. It's creating significant structural problems consequently. We run significant trade deficits. If I look at the sector that I'm in, the pharmaceutical sector, the trade deficit in pharmaceuticals is in excess of 35 billion. It's closer to 40 billion rand. Now, for a country with our disease burden, and with a country that's been saying that over the last 12 months we need to have security of supply of medicines, vaccines, and other critical medical equipment because of the global constraints we've seen, occasioned by COVID. Having all of those plans and policies, if we don't start implementing these in practical terms, then we will continue to be highly exposed, continue to run trade deficits. Rating agencies, incidentally, don't like trade deficits. So that's just one aspect of looking at it. So we do need to have a serious discourse in our country around how we bridge these trade deficits and how we localize. There's no better multiplier effect back into the economy than when you start localizing them, producing things locally like many other economies do. We need to take this to, we're at a tipping point with localization, in my opinion. And we're either going to lose the industrialization debate once and for all, or we need to tip it in the right direction and start implementing in both the private and the public sector, proper local procurement underpinned by industrialization.
And from your experience, what are the reasons that South Africans actually don't choose local products over international ones? They rather spend a bit more in some instances even.
Look, this is obviously a very complex question because it's very much sector specific. One has to analyze this by sector. And what I must do again, I need to give due credit to the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, the DTIC. Minister Patel and his team have developed, as part of their industrial plan, they've developed a target-based import replacement strategy. It's a 5-year plan. It covers a number of sectors. There are at least 20 sectors. For each sector, a champion has been identified. I'm that person in pharmaceuticals. And the target is over the next 5 years that we reduce imports by 20%. So when things start becoming target-driven, they become measurable and quantifiable, and then you're able to assess where you are. It's going to require, in my sector, in pharmaceuticals, 2 specific areas that need to be addressed. Firstly, in the private sector, we're going to have to have a discussion with the large procurers of medicines. These are the funders, your medical scheme administrators and other funder groups. And then, of course, your large corporate pharmacies, your dispensing groups. So it's going to require putting across a coherent commercial reason to supporting this, but also unpacking what it means for broader society. So that's the one aspect in the private sector. In the public sector, it's going to mean aligning DTIC's objectives with those of the national health departments and the provincial health departments. And I'm afraid it's an area that we've gone backwards in the last 12 months. We still import most of our antiretrovirals, which is the single biggest volume driver in our country. And secondly, the capacity and capability we've got in the country to manufacture things locally is not being properly leveraged. That doesn't make sense because all you're doing is you're weakening the industrial base of the country when you should be strengthening it. So those are the 2 most immediate areas that we need to focus on in this plan of reducing imports by 20% that DTIC have put forward. And my final comment is the work that DTIC has done, and this is empirically driven, so they've gone sector by sector, starting with agro-processing and the poultry sector right down to the more complex sectors. If we do this correctly in the next 5 years, it's estimated it will add back 1.1 to 1.2 trillion rand back into the economy. So it's great banding these numbers around, and they make sense on paper. We now need to have a firm conviction of implementing these and measuring the progress year on year.
Now, also, you actually work in the pharmaceutical sector, as you've mentioned previously. Aspen Pharmacare Holdings Limited signed an agreement with Johnson & Johnson last year. Can you confirm that they'll be able to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines locally by the end of this month in a bid to try and encourage more of buying local?
Okay, so firstly, I'm only at liberty to discuss parts of the Johnson & Johnson agreement because these are, in fact, Johnson & Johnson products, or it's a Johnson & Johnson vaccine. The part that I can tell you is what we've gone public on previously. Johnson & Johnson has selected Aspen to be one of its 7 contract manufacturers around the world. We are the only one on the African continent, and I believe the only one at this point in time in the Southern Hemisphere that Johnson & Johnson have contracted the service from. It's a huge feather in the cap of the country, and it's a huge feather in the cap of Aspen because Johnson & Johnson, to place them in context, they are a company that has a market cap of around $440 billion. That's significantly bigger than the entire South African economy. Our GDP is around $380 billion. So for a company of that size and global reputation to select a South African company is certainly something that every single South African and Aspen can be proud of. So it's great to be in the mix producing for such a big global player, and it does again reinforce what we are capable of in our country. We are scientifically, technically, and also from a capability perspective, we are competent to produce vaccines and other complex pharmaceutical products.
And just speaking about the program that kicks off tomorrow, can you speak to us about what can be expected at the program and which other speakers will be on the lineup in addition to the President, of course, giving that keynote address on Tuesday?
So I think that there are a number of sectors covered, and I won't go into all of those sectors. The particular session that I'm speaking at on Tuesday is a panel discussion with President Ramaphosa, President of the Republic, and our Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Minister Ibrahim Patel. And then there are a number of speakers from business, including my colleague Martin Kingston. And then there are also speakers from Labour. Our colleagues from Labour are speaking. I believe Matthew Parks, our colleague from NEDLAC, is also speaking there. And the idea here is what we need to do is we need to start putting a cogent and coherent argument before the nation and before society to what are the benefits of supporting locally produced products. What does this actually mean to the man and woman on the street? And what, for me, the most important thing we can cover in this debate, and I really hope we get to cover this, is that there has to be consequence management if policies are not being implemented in our country. We've got some very fine policies, but we seem to fall short when it comes to practically implementing these. So we cannot continue having these great policies, talking about industrialization and the benefits of industrialization, and there's no consequence management when the industrial base keeps getting eroded. And I've just mentioned to you what's happened with antiretrovirals and also other oral solids. There was an oral solid tender which was adjudicated about a week ago, and there's a significant import bias again. Now we need to ask these questions. Why is this happening? There are companies that are barely represented in South Africa that are winning tenders. Now that cannot be in the long-term good of the country, its workforce, or its people, or the sustainability of industries. So I'm hoping in this panel discussion we can unpack these issues. Certainly I'm not going to mince my words around these issues on Tuesday because it requires that level of forthrightness and frankness.
Well, we are running out of...
Fix them once and for all.
Well, I do apologize for that. What I wanted to actually ask you, when you speak about consequence management, I know that you give a bit of some examples. Do you also want to see less corruption, for example, in the procurement processes as well? We have issues of fruitless and wasteful expenditure that are also happening in the SOEs. Will that also touch on those issues?
So look, the position of business is very clear. Business has for some time and will continue, as do our other NEDLAC partners like Labour and COSATU. When we discuss these issues in NEDLAC, I think there's a very firm and clear position. We cannot continue having corrupt practices that we see in procurement. We cannot continue seeing some of the maladministration and governance issues that we're experiencing. Many of those do lead to fruitless and wasteful expenditure. But in this particular context, when you're looking at procurement, we cannot just decide procurement on the old model that we did, which is purely a pricing-based discussion. You oversimplify things. We need to look at what are the best procurement decisions for the country in terms of economic recovery, economic growth, and also growing our labor force. We all know where we stand with unemployment in our country. It's not a good position. And these bad procurement decisions, both in the private and the public sector, just perpetuate the bad employment picture we're seeing, the pedestrian economic growth we're seeing, and it's not sustainable. We all know this. So we've got to start acting now. And acting now, maybe the summit is a good time and a good tipping point where we tip in the right direction.
Hopefully we will tip into that right direction. Now, just lastly, Stavros, talk to us about the attendance figures that you are expecting for the summit. And if someone wants to attend, do they register on the website? Where do they go to for more information? So
as you correctly point out, there is a website. And people can go into that website and there's a link and they can choose to participate. Of course, we are still in the midst of COVID, albeit that we're from a numbers point of view, on a downward trajectory. But of course, we still need to take the necessary cautions, follow the protocols that government has announced. And this is going to be a bit of a mixed summit, unfortunately, but I think we're all used to this by now, which is partly physical attendance and partly online attendance. So it's no different to, I think, what we've been experiencing and are becoming accustomed to.
Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. That was Aspen Pharmacare's Senior Executive.